What if one of the most important numbers on Earth is wrong? Not a small number, not a rounding error, the number. The number that decides how much money governments receive, how much political power regions get, how many schools are built, how many roads are funded, how much food aid is sent, how the world measures growth, poverty, power, and decline. Population.
I walk through silence, thick and cold, where shadows drift and time grows old. No voice to call, no path to take, just fog and fear with every ache. Souls in the fog.
We talk about population like it's simple, like every country just counts its people, writes down the total, and reports it to the world. But what if it's not that clean? What if some governments have reasons to make their populations look bigger than they are? What if others have reasons to hide people, miss people, or simply do not have the ability to count everyone accurately? And what if the real problem is even stranger than fraud? What if nobody knows truly exactly how many people there are? Because once you start looking closely, population becomes more than a statistic. It becomes money and power. It becomes representation and national pride. When a number has that much value, people are going to fight over it. In Nigeria, population figures have long been tied to political power and government resources. In China, decades of population growth raises questions that seem impossible at first, until you understand how birth rates, death rates, infant mortality, and government policy actually interact. In India, the question may not be whether the number is fake, but how confident can anyone be when the country hasn't had a full new census in years? And in the United States, even one of the wealthiest countries on earth openly admits that its census can overcount some places and undercount others. So the question is this: can humanity actually count itself? And if the answer is no, then how much of the modern world is being built on numbers that we only think we understand? Before we ask whether population numbers can be trusted, we need to understand that something much more important. Why would anyone care enough to manipulate these numbers in the first place? Because at first glance, population sounds boring. It's a head count, just a statistic, a number on a spreadsheet. But in reality, population is one of the most valuable numbers a government can possess. Because population is not just about people. Population is power. Think about it this way. Imagine two regions inside the same country. One claims to have 5 million people, the other claims to have 10 million people. If government money is distributed based on population, who's getting more schools? Who gets more infrastructure money? Who gets more hospitals? Who gets more political representation? Who gets more influence? Suddenly, population stops being a statistic and it becomes leverage. In some countries, larger populations can mean more seats in government, more federal money, more influence over national decisions. Sometimes it even lends greater military or geopolitical importance. On the international stage, population matters too. A country with a massive population may appear economically powerful, politically important, or strategically indispensable. Foreign investors look at population. Governments planning aid look at population. Economists use population to calculate everything from labor force to productivity and quality of life. Even a country's success or failure can look very different depending on population figures. Let's take a simple example. Imagine a country produces $1 trillion in economic output. Now this sounds impressive, but divide that by population and suddenly the story is going to change. If $1 trillion is shared across 50 million people, the average economic output per person looks very different than it is if it's spread across 200 million. The same economy, a completely different narrative. This is one reason population data matters so much. It changes how governments are judged, how economies are ranked, and how success is measured. And once money, political power, reputation, and resources become tied to any kind of a number, a difficult question begins to follow, is what incentives exist to make that number look larger or smaller? Now this is where we have to be a little careful, because having an incentive is not proof of wrongdoing in and of itself. Just because someone benefits from something doesn't automatically mean that fraud happened. But incentives matter because, well, they tell us where to look. If population determines money and power, then population numbers become valuable, and valuable numbers are often disputed. Sometimes that dispute comes from politics. We see that in election result lawsuits fairly frequently. Sometimes it's bad record keeping or poor census methods. Sometimes it's outdated data, and sometimes it's something far less dramatic. The simple reality that counting millions or billions of constantly moving humans may be far harder than most of us would actually consider it to be. Because before we ask whether governments lie, we already know that, but we should probably ask a more uncomfortable question first. Is counting humanity accurately even something that's really possible? Before we start pointing fingers at the governments, conspiracies, or corruption, we'll address something directly, and that's that counting human beings is exceedingly difficult. And the larger a country becomes, the harder that problem gets, because most people imagine a census like this. Someone knocks on your door, every person gets counted, the final number goes into a spreadsheet, done. Simple. But real life, it doesn't work that way. People move. People disappear from the records. Children are born in places with poor documentation. Families relocate. You have migrants crossing borders. Some people avoid government contact entirely. Others live in places that are also physically difficult to reach. And in some cases, entire communities exist far outside the systems governments rely on to track them. Think about how messy normal life already is. How many people move apartments, forget their paperwork, or live temporarily with relatives? How many people split time between homes or work seasonally in one place while officially living somewhere else? And consider those who avoid filling out government forms unless absolutely necessary. Now imagine scaling all of that confusion to hundreds of millions of people. Over a billion. Suddenly the idea of a perfectly accurate count definitely falls apart. Even wealthy countries struggle. The United States openly admits that its census misses some people and accidentally counts others incorrectly. Certain groups are historically harder to count. Young children, people moving frequently, homeless populations, rural residents, immigrants, renters, people who distrust the government. And if a wealthy country with satellites, computers, massive budgets, and advanced bureaucracy can't perfectly count its population, what happens in the poorer countries? What happens in nations with the weak record keeping? Or places where roads barely exist? Or regions affected by war, migration, corruption, or political instability? Here's another fun fact. Many population numbers are not even exact counts. They're just estimates. We imagine governments literally counting every person. But what happens is often closer to an informed estimation. The census happens, then years pass, people are born, people die, people move, and statisticians use models to estimate what the population probably looks like between major counts. Think of it less like counting every fish in the ocean and more like trying to estimate how many fish exist based on repeated measurements. And once estimates enter the picture, uncertainty enters the chat. Now, uncertainty doesn't mean deception. If someone says a country has 100 million people, that may really mean we believe it's somewhere around 100 million based on the best available information. Not that we physically counted every person and we know this with a perfect certainty. The difference matters more than most people would think, because once you understand how population is measured, something becomes clear. Before asking whether governments manipulate numbers, we first have to accept that the numbers may already be less precise than we've generally assumed to begin with. And nowhere does the tension between population, politics, and incentives become clearer than in one country that has spent decades arguing over who gets counted and why. Nigeria. Earlier we asked why population matters, and Nigeria shows us what happens when population becomes contested. Because in Nigeria, census numbers have never been treated as boring statistics. They have been argued over, challenged, distrusted, and at times politically explosive. To understand why, imagine this. You're not just counting people, you're counting influence. In many countries, census numbers shape government planning, but in Nigeria, critics argue population figures can influence something much larger than that. Who matters politically, who gets heard, who gains leverage, and who loses it. And for decades, census results in Nigeria have been controversial. Different regions, political factions, as well as journalists and researchers have questioned whether official counts reflect reality. Sometimes quite openly and fiercely. And at the center of the controversy is a difficult question. What happens when people stop believing that count is neutral? Because once trust disappears, every number begins to look suspicious. A city grows rapidly and people wonder, were those numbers exaggerated? Region reports larger population gains than expected. And critics ask, well, who benefits from this? A census is announced and suddenly it's no longer just mathematics, it becomes politics. Part of the reason this matters so much is Nigeria's complexity. It's a massive country with huge regional differences, fast urban growth and migration, remote communities with religious divisions or ethnic divisions, and competing political interests, and then you combine all of this with a system where representation, influence, and resources can become tied to those population numbers. You don't need a conspiracy theory to create distrust. You only need competing incentives, and this is an important distinction. Nigeria is not necessarily a story of proven fraud, but it is a story of contested legitimacy. And those things are different, but sometimes the issue isn't whether a number is fake. Sometimes the issue is whether enough people believe the number to trust it. And even if everybody acted honestly, Nigeria still faces a challenge shared by many nations. How do you accurately count millions of people moving through sprawling cities, isolated settlements, informal communities, and rapidly changing regions? How much of the controversy comes from politics, and how much comes from the simple reality that counting humans is incredibly hard? If Nigeria represents a crisis of trust, China represents something a little stranger. Because at first glance, China's population story feels almost impossible. A country devastated by war somehow experiences this explosive growth, and later becomes famous for restricting births, and yet still grows into one of the largest populations in human history. It feels contradictory, until the numbers start telling a different story. At a glance, China's population story feels impossible. A country devastated after World War II, followed by the civil conflict that led to poverty, disease, famine, and political upheaval through the 50s. And somehow, over the second half of the 20th century, its population absolutely explodes. And then comes the part almost everyone has heard of, the one-child policy. A government famous for limiting births, which creates a natural question. How did China grow so dramatically if it eventually became known for restricting population growth? It feels very contradictory. But to understand China, you have to realize that restrictions came much later than people actually assume. This wasn't something that they always had. When we think of modern China, we often imagine a country always tightly controlling family size. But after the establishment of the modern Chinese state in 1949, population growth was not initially treated as a problem. In fact, for years, large populations were often viewed as strength. And more workers, more production, more soldiers, which meant more national power. The strict limits that people think about would not fully arrive until decades later. Knowing this, we know that the mystery isn't how did China grow despite decades of birth restrictions, but the better question is what happens when birth rates remain high while death rates suddenly begin to fall. And this is where the demographics start behaving in ways that feel unintuitive. People tend to imagine population growth as mostly about having more babies. But population is really a balance between the two forces of how many people are born and how many people die. Think of it like filling a bathtub. Births are water flowing in. Deaths are water draining out. Now, if births stay high while fewer people die, the tub fills very quickly. And this is where another statistic often gets misunderstood. You've probably heard statements like, people in the past only lived to 35, or 40 years old used to be elderly. That idea is deeply misleading and completely wrong. What historians are often describing as life expectancy at birth. That number is heavily distorted by infant and childhood mortality. If many children die young, the average age of that nation drops dramatically. That doesn't mean that adults are routinely dropping dead at 35. Quite far from it. Adults who survive childhood often live much longer than people imagine, usually into their 60s or 70s, and sometimes even beyond that. Now that matters for understanding population growth, because if more children are surviving infancy, and if disease is becoming less deadly, sanitation is improving, vaccines are spreading, and adults are beginning to survive longer as well, the population can accelerate very quickly without families suddenly having to dramatically have a lot more children. And that's largely what happened in China. Following the decades of war and instability, mortality began falling in many areas. Public health improved. Disease control improved. Infant survival improved. Meanwhile, birth rates, they remained high. More babies were surviving and more adults were surviving into older ages. Larger families continuing. The result is a rapid population expansion. Suddenly, what first looks impossible starts looking a lot more mathematically understandable. But this is where China becomes complicated again, because understanding how growth happens does not automatically end the controversy in the first place. In fact, for some people, it begins one. Critics and some demographers have raised questions about whether China's more modern population figures are perfectly accurate. Some argue local officials may have had incentives to report inflated numbers. Others argue census systems may have introduced errors or inconsistencies. Still others point out something almost paradoxical. During the one-child era, some births may have actually gone unreported. Families sometimes avoided reporting unauthorized children to escape the penalties that they would have had to pay. Meaning some people may have disappeared from official numbers temporarily, only to appear later. So China presents a strange possibility, which is, could some numbers have been overstated, while others were understated? And this is where things stop feeling simple, because once politics, incentives, bureaucracy, fear, and imperfect record-keeping all get mixed up into one big pot, your population becomes less like a precise measurement, more like an enormous statistical puzzle. But if China raises questions about explosive growth and contested numbers, India raises some different questions entirely. What happens when the counting itself begins to lag behind reality? Well, China's story feels like a demographic mystery. India feels like a statistical one, because when people talk about India's population, the first reaction is often simple disbelief. So how confident are we in the number itself? Well, first we need to separate something that often gets confused. A population that feels unimaginably large is not the same thing as a population that is mathematically impossible. These large numbers stop feeling intuitive. Most people are actually terrible at mentally grasping scale. 1 million sounds enormous. 1 billion sounds only slightly bigger. But 1 billion is 1,000 millions, and once populations reach that size, growth behaves differently than people instinctively would expect it to. Imagine a small town of 1,000 people. 10 families have children, growth feels modest. Now imagine hundreds of millions of young adults reaching the age where they start families. Even if each family has fewer children than previous generations, the total number of births can still be massive. And this concept is called population momentum. And it's just one of the reasons that large countries continue growing even after birth rates begin to fall. Because fewer children per family does not automatically mean fewer births overall. If enough adults exist, even smaller families can still create enormous population growth. Think of it this way. You have a country where every family suddenly decides to have only 2 children. No, that sounds stable. But if an enormous generation of young adults is now entering adulthood, millions upon millions of births still occur simply because so many people are having families at the same time. Population has momentum, like a freight train. You can begin slowing it down long before it actually stops moving. And this helps explain why India continued growing even as fertility rates gradually decline. But there's another reason that India raises difficult questions. Unlike many countries, India has gone years without a new full national census. Most of us assume governments constantly know exactly how many citizens exist. But the reality is much messier, and a census happens, years will pass, children are born, people die. The cities expand, villages shrink. And migration can reshape an entire region. And eventually governments rely on projections and statistical estimates until the next major count happens. Now, in India's case, this becomes important because the most recent completed national census took place years ago, meaning a lot of the conversation about India's present population relies on demographic modeling rather than a fresh person-by-person count. No, this doesn't mean that India has invented hundreds of millions of people. That leap would be irresponsible. But it does raise a more reasonable concern. How precise should we pretend these numbers really are? Because when headlines confidently announce exact population totals, it can create the illusion of certainty. As though someone literally counted every person yesterday, just 1, 2, duck, duck, goose. But in reality, it often exists in something closer to an informed estimate built from births, deaths, surveys, migration patterns, and statistical projections. And like any model, these estimates, they contain uncertainty. Other challenges include the fact that India is enormous. Dense megacities with extremely remote villages, migrating laborers creating informal settlements, populations that move seasonally for work, and communities that can be difficult to document consistently. And even with the best of intentions, counting becomes difficult in a place like this. So India presents a very different type of population question than Nigeria or China. Nigeria asks, what happens when incentives make population politically contested? China asks, how do we explain explosive demographic change and disputed modern figures? India asks something quieter, but perhaps just as important. How certain are we when the count itself becomes increasingly dependent upon estimations? And then we arrive now at a country that does something unusual. Instead of claiming perfect accuracy, the United States openly admits that it gets the count wrong. That the United States admits to getting something wrong? Did I? Checking notes. Okay. Huh. Nigeria raises questions about incentives, China raises questions about the demographic plausibility, and India brings about the uncertainty issues. But the United States raises a different question entirely. What happens when a government openly admits that its numbers aren't even accurate? The United States doesn't claim a census perfection. Surprise, surprise. In fact, it openly acknowledges that some people get missed, that others get counted incorrectly, and that some places are statistically overcounted while others are undercounted. And this gives us something important. Population counting is not a perfect science. It's an ongoing attempt to measure something messy, human life. Think about the challenge for a moment. A country of hundreds of millions of people moving constantly, families splitting households, college students living away from home, military members relocating. You got immigrants arriving, homeless populations, children born between surveys, people distrustful of the government, people living off grid. You got others moving 3 times in a single year, and you have to ask yourself, what would a perfect count even look like? Because most people imagine a census worker knocking on every door and checking every name off of a master list. But modern population measurement is much more complicated. There are surveys, administrative records, statistical corrections, follow-up sampling, birth records, death records, tax information, housing data, school enrollment, and employment information. Not to identify every person individually from some giant conspiracy board, but to cross-check whether the numbers roughly make sense together. And this is where many population theories run into their first major problem. If a government invents tens of millions of people, what could we expect to happen? The mismatch would likely begin appearing everywhere. Not in one place, but everywhere. You would expect strange gaps between population and lived reality. Schools with far fewer students than expected. Housing occupancy patterns behaving strangely. Workforce numbers collapsing relative to the census totals. Consumption patterns wildly disconnected from the reported population. Utility demand looking inconsistent with the number of residents supposedly living there. But this is where intuition can trick us. Take housing, for example. A common argument sounds like this. Everywhere I look, houses are being built, but I don't see population exploding. That feeling is understandable. But housing demand and population are not the same thing. Sometimes more housing reflects more people. Sometimes it reflects fewer people living together. Think about how households have changed. Decades ago, larger families were common. Multiple generations sometimes lived together, on end. And more children shared homes. But now, we have more single adults, more elderly people living alone, more divorces. There's more couples without children, fewer people per household. Meaning the same population can require far more housing. Imagine 100 people living 5 to a house. That requires 20 homes. Now imagine the same 100 people living 2 to a house. Suddenly 50 homes are needed. The population didn't change, the housing demand did. And geography can complicate things even further. One city grows rapidly and another declines. A suburb can expand while a rural county just empties out. So a booming neighborhood does not automatically prove national population growth is suspicious. But housing isn't the only objection people raise. People point to utility bills as well. Electric and gas bills constantly rising. People install efficient appliances, solar panels, better insulation. Still, it feels like the costs only keep climbing. So one might ask, if technology improves efficiency, why do bills keep going up? Well, this is where another distinction matters. Higher bills are not the same thing as higher usage. A family can use the same electricity as 4 years ago and still pay dramatically more if those energy prices have risen. Fuel costs shift, grid maintenance changes, infrastructure upgrades happen, insurance costs rise, the rate structures change, utilities charge fixed delivery fees. In other words, higher costs do not automatically mean more people are consuming more energy, and even solar creates confusion. Many people are assuming that solar automatically eliminates major electrical costs. Sometimes it helps significantly. Sometimes households still pay connection fees, nighttime electricity costs, equipment financing, or face changing utility rates. The story becomes more complicated. Then more solar should mean lower bills. Then there's school enrollment. Children tend to leave footprints in systems like the school system and the medical system. If tens of millions of children suddenly existed only on paper, the schools would struggle to hide the mismatch. And interestingly, some American districts today are shrinking, not expanding. Partly because birth rates have fallen, and there are programs like Medicare and Social Security. Critics often point to stories about fraud, duplicate records, or even claims of dead people remaining inside government databases. And yes, government systems absolutely contain errors and fraud happens. Administrative mistakes also happen, but here we have to separate two different ideas: bad records and a fake population. A person remaining in a database is not automatically someone receiving benefits or being counted in the population totals. An outdated record is not automatically proof of millions of phantom citizens existing. These problems may point toward bureaucracy, inefficiency, or fraud, but they do not automatically prove massive population fabrication. The biggest lesson America's population number teaches us is even with enormous budgets, advanced systems, and decades of statistical experience, counting humans is still messy, imperfect, and highly disputable, which raises the uncomfortable possibility that maybe uncertainty is actually normal. Maybe every country is estimating more than we realize, and if that's the case, then what if humanity has been getting population wrong in more than one direction? Up to this point, most of the questions asked sound familiar. Are governments inflating our numbers? Are census systems unreliable? Can politics shape population statistics? But what if we've been asking the wrong question? Because there is another possibility, one that sounds almost backwards. What if in some places populations aren't being exaggerated? What if they're being missed entirely? Now, at first, this sounds ridiculous in our modern age. After all, how do you lose millions of people? But think about what we've already covered. Counting humans is a mess. People move, records fail, rural regions can be difficult to document. Entire communities may sit far from infrastructure or government systems of any kind. Migrant populations shift constantly. Informal settlements, they appear and disappear. And once researchers begin relying on models instead of a literal person-by-person count, assumptions enter the equation. Now, recently, some researchers have argued that certain population data sets may underestimate rural populations in parts of the world. The argument isn't necessarily that governments are hiding people, lying, or inventing numbers. The concern is simpler and a little stranger. The systems themselves may struggle to accurately see remote populations. Think about how modern systems work. The city is easy to measure. Infrastructure exists, addresses exist, utilities, school, phones exist, paperwork exists. But what about scattered settlements, remote farming communities, communities where documentation is inconsistent? People living off-grid or underground, and then suddenly counting becomes much harder. And if those places are missed, the conversation shifts. Instead of asking, are governments exaggerating the population, we begin asking, how much uncertainty actually exists in either direction? Could some governments be overestimating populations because incentives reward higher numbers? Possibly. Could some regions be underestimated because counting is genuinely difficult? Also possible. Can both things happen at once? That possibility may be the oddest, but most accurate conclusion. Because human beings, we love us some certainty. We like clean numbers, definite answers. A single figure we can point to and say, that's how many people exist. That's how many there are. But the reality is a lot messier. Population is not one perfectly measured number. It's a constantly shifting estimate built from mounds of imperfect information. Sometimes more accurate, sometimes less. Sometimes it's influenced by politics or logistics. And sometimes it's challenged by simple human behavior itself. After traveling through the controversies in Nigeria, our demographic mysteries in China, estimation problems in India, and open uncertainty in the United States, a difficult question emerges. What if the biggest misconception is not that governments secretly know the real number and they lie to us about it? What if the truth is simply that nobody knows with perfect certainty? At the beginning of the episode, we asked a simple question. What if one of the most important numbers on Earth is wrong? Not slightly, not off by a rounding error, but less certain than we have been taught to believe. And after looking at Nigeria, China, India, and the United States, the answer turns out to be both less dramatic and more unsettling than many conspiracy theorists would suggest, which is because the deeper we look, the harder it became to separate three very different things: fraud, politics, and uncertainty. Nigeria showed us how population can become political currency. When representation, resources, and influence become tied to numbers, trust in those numbers can begin to erode. China showed us how demographic change can look impossible until you understand how the birth rates, infant mortality, life expectancy, and survival rates actually interact. A country does not need endlessly rising birth rates to experience explosive growth. Sometimes just less people dying is enough. India reminded us that many modern population figures are not exact real-time head counts. They're projections, estimates built from models trying to measure constantly changing human populations. And the United States demonstrates something that, perhaps most important of all, is that wealthy governments, even with all of their advanced systems, openly acknowledge that counting humans is imperfect. It's a mess. And that leaves us with the realization that most people speak about population as though it is precise and known quantity, but the reality, many of the numbers shaping politics, economics, infrastructure, and global planning contain far more uncertainty than we actually imagine. Now, while this doesn't automatically mean deception, it doesn't prove that governments invented or erased hundreds of millions of people anywhere, but it does mean that the world is likely more statistically fragile than most of us realize. And it really shouldn't surprise us. Humanity has mapped the ocean floor more thoroughly than some countries have mapped their own populations. We're trying to count billions of constantly moving people across deserts, forests, mountains, megacities, slums, the isolated villages and refugee camps, and rapidly changing economies. Perfect accuracy may not be unrealistic, but maybe the strangest part of all is this. The modern world runs on these numbers, accurate or not. Governments plan around them, economies depend on them, resources are distributed because of them, policies are justified by them, and yet behind the confidence of official statistics exists something much less solid than we assume. Not necessarily lies or conspiracies, but actual uncertainty. It's not that humanity secretly knows the exact number and the ruling class hides it from us. but that we desperately want certainty in a world that may be far more difficult to measure than we're comfortable admitting. Because in the end, the question isn't how many people are there really. The real question is how accurately can humanity count itself at all?